Okay, I've always wanted to make this video, which is just like an exploration, an expression of what school was like for me, what I saw, and what I knew between kindergarten and going up to around about the high school level, later high school level. Um, I always hear this constant preaching, this modern ideological preaching of wonderful teachers, wonderful schools, doing all these wonderful things for kids. But I think it pays to sort of step outside that ideological bubble that gets rammed into our heads and just remember for yourself what it was like, when you went to school, where the teachers were really at, what they were like at your younger years, if you can remember them. And I'll start from kindergarten to show you what I saw going through school. Now, when I was about 3.5 years old, I had to go to kindergarten, like so many of us do, um, away from mum, and yeah, for about 3 hours in the morning for kindergarten. That was when she got a part-time job, I think, and yeah, she was sort of forced to outsource me to kindergarten. I remember how calm and happy I was before I had to go to kindergarten, because I was able to stay at home for a few months, however long it was, with just mum and me at home. And no one can tell me that, in principle at least, a young child should be away from their mothers at those sort of ages. No one can tell me that and convince me of that because I was there. I remember how I felt. I saw the situation clearly, and I can remember what it feels like to be 3.5 years old and to not be with your mother when you need to be with your mother. And I'm that's coming from a first person perspective, not a clipboard ticking boxes, checking for results, which may mean anything ultimately. Now, so I remember having to go to kindergarten. I wasn't afraid to go to kindergarten. I sort of learnt to hate it very, very quickly, though, because it was just, I have to speak freely without meaning to sound too dramatic. It was a cold blooded environment. It was had a horrible Mad Max flavor to it. It's like, fucked up little kids everywhere. Well, not, well, maybe that's a little harsh, just kids who obviously had mothers that weren't nearly as nice as my mother. That's probably the best way I can put it, and there's no doubt that kids bring to the schoolyard exactly what they've received at home because they psychologically normalize to their homes and recreate their fun, they bring their psychological state to school and create their environment with it. I mean, even in kindy, kids started to group together and form gangs, and yeah, just not a friendly, pleasant environment at all, really. I mean, the teachers, or should I say, the caretakers in kindergarten, they weren't bad people. They were quite nice, but they were completely distant from me. Just one or two caretakers and a zillion kids. They basically didn't exist. As I said before, it's like a Mad Max environment. I hated it. It was tense. I wasn't comfortable there. I didn't really make I didn't make lots of friends there, but that's never been my style. I've never joined groups. I always have like one or two specific friends, good friends. That's the way it was with me at school, and most of them were girls. So I think that girls I just found less abusive and more nice at kindergarten. But yeah, so all I can say for it is that, boy, I used to remember holding mum's hand, walking up to kindergarten, and just hating the horrible feeling of having to walk through those gates and put up with that place for 3 hours. Also had to stay at another little girl's place in the as a to be taken care of until mum finished work, and that was, she was a bitch. She was a nasty little piece of work. Acted out with me and all the rest of it. I remember shoving the hose down my pants and turning it on. It wasn't funny. Yeah, that's just one of those memories I have. But I remember feeling so happy because she was a bit older, when she went to school. I thought, God, thank God for that. Get that bitch out of my face, that horrible little kid. And I remember the way her mother, when I was staying at the friend of my mother's place, I remember the way she looked when she was sitting there with her coffee at the table, and when I said, "Where's XYZ?" I can't remember her name. And she just looked over at me and said, "She's at school." And just the way she did it, I could just see it all instantly. I could see where that little girl got her personality from. Her mother was basically a hard, depressive type person. And that mother was that little girl's world. That's why she was not a nice human being. Unfortunately, it's very sad. I mean, no one's born an arsehole. They're born into an arsehole context and they normalise to it. Right, and then I went to school. I hated that almost as much as kindy. The kids, especially the boys, were just bastards. You know, one of the worst things I remember was having to sit at the stairs, and this gang of little shits came up behind me and punched me in the back and took turns doing it. And they had no reason to do it. They just wanted to do it. They could, and they wanted to. You know, little cute sweetie pies. They're like that to the adults. Take away the adults, and all of a sudden the neurosis starts to rear its ugly head. Yeah. They had lots of mates, lots of friends like that, but no true friends. They weren't friendly people. Only friendly people have friends. They had comrades. And I remember the teachers totally believed in what they were doing. But they were like Nazis, basically. Just very controlling, communistic type people. A little bit strange. They had this ideological warp in their head, because you can see these things when you're a kid. You know what they're made of. Heartless. I mean, my first teacher at school, I remember she wasn't a bad person. She was truly well-intentioned, but massively repressed. She was like, you know, one of those religious nuns, half psychologically dead, just waiting to get through life so they can get into heaven and Jesus or something like that. But yeah, but I remember hating it so much. And I specifically resented being separated from my older brother and two sisters. I thought, why? I mean, I accepted, like everyone at the beginning, that school was a necessary evil. That's what I believed. I now know better. That we just had to do it. But one thing I couldn't understand was, why did they separate me from my siblings? I couldn't see any good reason for that. And yeah, there is no good reason for it. But that was one insight I could see. For that, I would have been so much happier if I had my family with me, rather than these strangers who were never, unfortunately, my kind of people. I mean, the things that they were interested in and talked about were, to me, I just didn't care. I had nothing to say to them, and they hardly had anything to say to me. But one vision, I'll never forget this vision. I was 5 years old at school. This is my first part of my school year, doing this horrible, horrible, dry work. Feeling threatened, of course. You always feel threatened fundamentally at school. Like, if you don't play ball, you don't keep up with what they want, then, you know, the proverbial is going to hit the fan. But I remember doing this horrible work, and sitting at the table with these other boys. I wanted to sit with the girls, but I couldn't because I got hassled for that, so I had to sit with the boys. And I just wanted to say to them, "Isn't this horrible?" And I just stopped myself as soon as I said it, as soon as I was about to say it. And I just knew, if I said that to these guys, they would hate my guts. They would target me, and I'll be targeted for abuse from them. Because it's like telling them something that a part of them knows, but they don't want to know it. They had a way more deeper acceptance of what they had to put up with than I did. My guess is that when they went home, they had the equivalent of a school teacher for a mother. And when they went home, they had serious pressure on them that it's all about the school. Get on with your school, focus on it. And they probably had to have a more deeper acceptance of it than I do. And when that happens, they're not going to feel it so much for what it is. And what I'm doing, if I was to say to them, you know, "Isn't this horrible?" as I'm telling them, your life is shit and it's not going to get any better, is it? This is your world. You have to put up with it. And I just knew that, and I stopped myself. "Andrew, keep your mouth shut. Don't say anything." Because, yeah, it's quite sad, really. I mean, and I remember pondering the idea of boarding school. Like, imagine actually having to live in this fucking communist structure. Imagine that. So you couldn't even go home. Honestly, I just couldn't imagine anything more miserable a more cruel thing to do to a child than to actually have them live inside a school. It's fucked up shit, man. Don't do that to kids. It's ugh. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I thought of school. It was socially horrible. I didn't like it. I never really embraced it or accepted it as part of my world. For me, there were always two worlds: school world and outside school. And, it was like day prison. I just had to hold my breath and put up with it. But and the work, there was just no interest in it. No interest in the work whatsoever. I did not want to do it. And when you're very, very young, having to do work that you have absolutely no interest in is very hard. It's a different kind of boredom. It's just miserable. A nasty thing to do to kids. And again, I'll talk about it later. Extremely unnecessary thing to do to kids. Right, now going forward a bit, I think it was I don't know, my second or third year at school, still in primary school. I remember wandering outside by myself, asking myself, would I ever want to have kids? Because I was the kind of kid that would contemplate these sort of things a lot. And I honestly said to myself, I don't know, because I don't know if I could force them to go through school and to put up with what I had to put up with. Yeah, so, I mean, stand outside that and sort of, what are you looking at? You're looking at, a human being asking themselves whether or not they're living in a context which is acceptable for fertility. Do I want to breed in such a toxic, inhuman context? That's how I felt. And it wasn't just me. My brother was exactly the same. He actually tried to get out of school by hiding under a car at one stage, and wagged as much as he possibly could just to escape it. And I remember him telling me he once had a school teacher for a short period of time who was so nice to the kids, and he couldn't understand it. And when that temporary teacher left, he actually thought he must have been fired, because from his experience, school teachers were not allowed to be nice. They had to be assholes to kids. He couldn't understand how this, why did he leave? He must have been fired for being nice. You've got to be an asshole, until he found out later that it was a relieving teacher who was only there for a couple of months or something. Yeah, but that tells you something, doesn't it? And boy, they were bitches, highly strung bitches. Real conformist types. And the interesting thing with the conformists in an authoritative position is that if you don't conform, they hate you for it. It's almost like an unconscious thing, like, I had to conform, I had to normalize to this. How dare you not think that you don't have to go through what I went through? It's almost like passing on the payback or something. You get that a lot with some people. Anyway, moving on through school, the older you get, the easier it is. Probably because you're less vulnerable, so you don't feel the pain signals quite so brutally. And, also more oppressed. As you get older, your defense systems start to kick in. You can tolerate a lot more shit. I remember that. So I went through high school, and then there was when I was about standard 3, I remember saying to myself, and I think I might have snapped part of myself, when we all go through repressions, repressed part of myself, but I remember declaring, I will never forget how much I hate this place. That's probably where I locked it into my brain that, I will do my bit to try and reform this completely unnatural monster called state institutional schooling. The most arrogant structure ever known to man, as far as I'm concerned. Who the hell do these people think they are, to, by force, take kids away from their families and to put them through all these learning processes, so-called learning processes, which are just a joke. Okay, so we'll get into intermediate. How old was I then? I don't know. Somewhere between 11 and 13 years or something. Now, that was a very interesting time, because it's almost, I'm suspicious it was almost a social experiment, because Form 1 and Form 2, in those 2 years, I was put in classes where all the kids there were actually nice. All of them. Not one horrible little bastard kid coming from an abusive background that scares everybody and all that sort of thing. Not one. And it was more enjoyable, more interesting, less horribly dry and institutional. I still didn't like it. I still, God, I had better things to do than go to that place. But the whole atmosphere and the teachers as well were friendlier and nicer and completely different to what I'd known before. Not revolutionarily different, but quite distinctly different. Still had lots of boring bits, but it was only the class I was in and another class, the classes I was in, along with a few other classes. Then there was the other half of the school, which was full of, your real little shits. Totally different feeling. And luckily, we were insulated from it. It's almost like an experiment to see how kids behave when you get that really toxic, nasty element out of it. And you learn better, you think better, you're happier, you're more relaxed. Well, or should I say you memorize better? I don't know if it's fair to say learn better. Um, yeah, there's just no comparison. And that's one of the things that part of the reason I think why I've always been very aggressive on getting rid of the bully kids. Just get them out of the schools. It's not fair that others have to put up with that kind of kid. Isolate them to another class or whatever. It's just not fair that those kids should be allowed to socially pollute an entire environment. I mean, the hard truth is it only takes the smallest amount of poo to contaminate a punch bowl and make it pretty much undrinkable. I learnt that. So yeah, let's have a bit of discrimination, please, for young kids. So intermediate wasn't too bad. Then I got into high school. It was bearable, a bit more bearable, third, fourth, and fifth form. I did very well. I remember doing extremely well with mathematics in my third form year, but in my maths class, but that's actually because I had horrible kids in there. Ones that I really didn't like, and I actually used my education as a way to disassociate from them and just focus on the work. Although the teacher in that class was actually very good. He was a nice guy. He was a very good man. I actually liked him. Very rare for you have teachers like that, but they do exist, and they seem to exist more in high school than primary school for some interesting reason. You would hope it would be the other way around, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be. So he was a nice guy, and I used maths to escape the class. I know I did, and that's why I concentrated quite well. It's like a dissociative concentration going into the maths, and so I did very well, but for the wrong reasons. When I got into my fifth form year, it was the other. I was having lots of conversations with guys that I actually quite liked, some good guys in that class, and it was fun, and I only just managed to pass because I forgot almost everything because I hardly did anything in the class. So I almost failed in my fifth form maths year, but for the right reasons. I wasn't escaping into my schoolwork. I was doing what kids should probably be doing, young kids. But yeah, going back to my fourth form year, now this is where I had a very interesting event, which made me realize that this whole thing we call school isn't what it's cracked up to be. My English was always quite crappy. But the truth is, I never applied myself to it. All I wanted to do was to do what I had to do as much as I needed to do to get that bitch school teacher out of my face. Okay, that's all I care about, because once I left those gates, you can burn my books. I couldn't care less, and I used to ceremoniously rip my books to pieces at the end of the school year. It meant nothing to me. I mean, why should I care what people think of me who are not even friendly people? They're not actually nice people. It's like, why do I care what you think? You're not part of my world. You're not part of my life. Fuck off. That's how I felt. Yeah, and I didn't. So I didn't apply myself. Rambling a bit there, I apologise. But when I got to my fourth form year, I knew I had School C coming up, and I knew I had to pass my School C English. So I made an independent, self-determined effort. Okay, I've got to get on top of my English. I've got to improve it so I can pass School C. And so as an independent decision, not a forced decision coming from a teacher, I made the decision to improve my English. What did I do to do that? I took my school book, my homework assignment, which was to write out a page story on something, and then I just passed it over to my brother and my father and said, where have I gone wrong? They pointed out where I went wrong, the errors, and then they explained to me the errors, and I was actually listening because I wanted to learn, because I knew I got School C next year. I wrote it out again then after I knew what was wrong with all the corrections, and it reinforced it, stuck it in my head. I did exactly that for a few nights, probably about no more than 10 to 12 hours work, and my English improved through that high-speed debugging exercise radically. And I just thought, my God, I just did myself independently more for my English than what I'd done at school in the last 3 or 4 years in a few nights, just because I learnt like a human being in a human context, and it was my decision. I thought, here are all these school teachers effectively claiming to be the experts on education and learning, and me just being me, I just did more in 12 hours than what you did in 3 years. As I said, I thought there is something very, very funny going on with this whole schooling system, because that is not supposed to be possible. And then, I've written a heck of a lot about the reality of education and made some videos on that as well. But that's another whole topic and I don't want to go into it. But believe me, it's 90% bullshit, I'll tell you right now. It is bullshit. You do not need to put kids into those institutes. Right, my 6th form year. Now, that was when I couldn't just sort of bluff my way through everything, not really applying my mind at all. I had to sink my mind into it to actually retain stuff that I found, breathtakingly boring. And I immediately felt this feeling, I think it was about a third the way through the year, almost like a dark feeling coming over me. I can't describe it because I did not want to go there with my brain. That would be like walking away from myself and walking into a kind of deep, dark depression to actually allow myself to be consumed by that material. And I didn't do it. Like, a part of me rebelled from it. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's, with respect to my positive attributes, why I am the way I am. It's because I did rebel from it. Got out of that place. So I basically, although I did get 6th form certificate in key subjects, or was it maths, physics, and mathematical physics, I won't bore you with those details, I dropped out about halfway through that year because I just deeply hated it. I was not prepared to put my mind in that zone the way they wanted it. It was just depressing. Really depressing. Yeah. And I think that surprised a lot of the teachers, because I was obviously an intelligent kid, okay? And I was very interested in things. I was very interested in learning, in education. I still am. I love to learn about things that are relevant to me. But at the same time, here's this kid who's supposed to be, in many ways, a star pupil, backfired and just hated it so much. So I think a couple of my teachers actually felt insecure about the fact that I dropped out. Like, what the hell is going on? Yeah. Because, I was also, with my personal interests, I was also demonstrating that I was quite clever in certain levels. And, yeah. But I could not tolerate it. So, I was sort of like a bit of anecdotal evidence, I suppose, that they need to rethink the meaning of this institutional structure. Went on to do a bit of university. Tried that. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Hated it and dropped out. That as well. Yeah, no regrets, really. It's still, when I look at schools, when I walk past them sometimes, and I look inside universities, it's like, yeah, you get that feeling coming back. You remember the fundamental depression in the air. The institutional feeling. There's a silent misery inside these institutes. Yeah, so that's pretty much the end of it, except through my experience and also a lot of understanding now of what education really is and what it does and how necessary it is and isn't. It's still one of my primary goals in politics to reform it. I want to kill it. I want the money. I want to see a voucher system that also applies to homeschooling. And I want the option of free schooling to be given to families and kids so that they don't have to institutionalize the development of their children, which is completely unnecessary. And to stress it's perverse. I mean, kids are not supposed to learn like that. It's a totally unnatural context to learn. It's wrong. we shouldn't make a religion of it. We shouldn't say to ourselves, oh, kids need to go to school and learn. It's such a gift. I mean, really? Do you really need to institutionalize the learning process? No. You're just believing that because that's what everybody says and thinks, and you don't know what it's like to learn in a non-institutional manner. And it's all bullshit, I'm afraid. Thank you. That's all I want to say.